Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. I'm obviously FPL Fran, and we are doing a Game Week 8 review video as well as a Game Week 9 transfer plans video as well. So with Game Week 8, in terms of reviewing my team, this is not live rank that's totally updated. My live rank is actually here on the Fantasy Football Hub page, which you can find obviously in the link in description. But yeah, I mean, top 80k right now, huge rank rise, 65 point accumulated, obviously, and finally a green arrow, first one in around 3 weeks' time. So pretty happy with that. In terms of actually just looking at my team, obviously, in terms of reviewing them, happy with the decisions in terms of bench. Happy also that I actually have Gordon, who now basically has his suspension lifted. Lamptey, of course, was also rested due to fatigue, but at that sort of 3.9 position, it's really between Taylor and Lamptey. And I just like the opportunity of actually maybe going for Lamptey on game week 10 and maybe just chancing on the fact that he could play versus Fulham at home, those sorts of things as well. And just maybe in the future as well, just since he's actually a competent part of the squad, as soon as he starts going forwards, that maybe he can obviously be someone that I can play whenever Brighton actually start fixtures, with him in the team. So that's going to be Lamptey and Archer, obviously. Archer is just someone who, look, I preferred him to Mubama just to actually spend 0.2 so that I can actually have a bench in the future. Obviously, that we've seen that this season that there is a lot of injuries, more so injuries in terms of the key FPL players, but that sort of luck can obviously fall, my way. And the injuries, the red cards that are happening so far could obviously hurt me very hard. And it's nice to actually have a strong bench. Archer being a slightly stronger bench piece than Mubama, of course. Now, when we actually look at the team, obviously happy to make the decision, of course, of going for Turner as well, because that got me a net gain of 5 points. Saving, for example, the other 0.1 million on the keeper was the same logic as Archer. I just didn't want to do it. And ultimately, Turner has another really good fixture coming up, Luton Town at home. Now, the last time I had a keeper versus Luton Town at home was with Pickford, and it didn't go so well. But I'm hoping it turns out all right for the next fixture. As far as the team, I think obviously, looking at Colwell on my team is a little bit of a problem, but I didn't really want to spend the money towards Gabriel. Now, obviously, the outcome was that Colwell conceded within 15 minutes versus Burnley, and Gabriel kept a clean sheet versus Man City. But that's life, and I continue. So I think the thing is, too, is when I look at my team now, the problem point is probably still Richarlison, but it's a good problem to have because I always knew that I was going to transfer either Richarlison out or Maddison in Game Week 10. So the fact that Richarlison is sort of looking like a problem is not something that I'm too concerned with, just because they still have the Manor Solomon injury, and I still think that he'll get the start in Game Week 9 because there's the additional 2 days of rest, even though he will be on international break with this Brazilian national team. So from that context, I'm actually quite happy to own Richarlison just for another game week in Game Week 9 versus Fulham, and then I actually just get to move on away from Richarlison into hopefully an Arsenal midfielder in Game Week 10. Now, obviously, Arsenal have a tough fixture as well in Game Week 11. They've got Newcastle away. But the reality with Arsenal, I would say, is I'm very happy to either, move one defender into an Arsenal player then, or just move Richarlison out into another Arsenal midfield and also move Son out. I think there is an argument to say that maybe actually owning, for example, 2 Arsenal mids is better than 2 Spurs mids. And I'm happy to also make the double transfer that way because I think Porro is actually quite a nice option going forwards just to keep. Arsenal obviously are a great defense, and I'd be missing out on that. But I can always go back into the Arsenal defense in Game 8-12 after they play Newcastle. When we look at Trippier, for example, I still think that he's a fantastic season keeper, so no complaints about him there. And then Cash Diaby Watkins still have fantastic fixture ahead, so I don't really see the need to, for example, move on them at all. And I'm pretty happy I made the move from Mbumo to Diaby because even though Diaby only played 64 minutes, the reality, of course, is that he was rested mostly just due to the injury situation, and he's actually a forward for this Aston Villa team. So going forwards, I think Diaby's a great pick. Hopefully he gets back to full fitness over the international break and can be useful to us, and specifically useful, of course, in that Game Week 10 game versus Luton Town at home. In terms of captaincy, of course, what carried me was the Salah captaincy. I mean, huge, obviously, a 12-point gulf between him and Son, and obviously that gives me a huge, massive green-red arrow. Sorry, what? A green arrow, and yeah, that's sort of the game week, right? Because Haaland and Son blanked, and a lot of people went for a Haaland captaincy. A lot of other people went for a Son captaincy, and that's life. I think we have sort of 3 mums right now. It's really just Salah and Haaland. And to me, when I'm actually looking at the fixtures next week, even though Salah has a great game versus Everton in hand, I actually think that I'm going to go for a Haaland captaincy. It is a Brighton team that really, really, really look terrible, and I just think there's enough of a gap there where I think that Haaland will do better. It's a complete difference in, for example, the picture and the landscape between, let's say, Arsenal defense away and then also City, at home at the Etihad, where Haaland hopefully will have a fantastic fixture. So that's how I see things with my Game Week 8 team in terms of just a review. As far as obviously picking the team next week, this is exactly how I'm going to line up. I'll just be playing 11 home fixtures, hopefully, without the need for any benches needed. So obviously Archer and Colwell, both home fixtures as well, but just sort of playing the fixtures in terms of Archer, hopefully, he will be playing at home. So that's something that's a little bit nicer for an attacker. As far as Colwell, expecting for Arsenal to score still, even though Chelsea are at home, even though they've also been a good defense. And as I said, Colwell's just more someone who's just a fixture play when it comes to, let's say, 15 plus onwards, 16 plus really. And actually, when we, for example, look at Arsenal midfielders, I think the comparison needs to be made about whether we're happy to drop Son, right? Because obviously, once we're finished with the Fulham game, Crystal Palace obviously emerging as a fantastic defense. They're also away from home, and some of the other fixtures here, even the easier ones, are away from home. City as well. Very, very tough game there. And then actually, when you look at, let's say, Chelsea and Aston Villa at home, not exactly the best fixtures, I would say. And so when you compare it to, let's say, an Arsenal midfielder, like, let's say, Saka, who's probably hopefully going to be back fit, even though he was strangely omitted from the squad today, you have a situation where you've got ultimately in game week 10, Sheffield United, which is basically better than any Spurs fixture in the short term. And then obviously one bad fixture versus Newcastle, but then Burnley, Brentford, Wolves, Luton. These are all great games and honestly just way clear of the Spurs fixtures. So my initial, for example, transfer plans for game week 10, if I roll the free transfer in game week 9, is actually just going to go for Saka and Martinelli. Now, I'm actually expecting for Saka to hit a price fall because he obviously was omitted from the squad today. And based on, for example, some of the price sites, you can see that Saka is very close to a price fall. Whether that actually happens, I'm not exactly sure about that. I'm not so confident about that. It could be the case that he actually, for example, stays at 8.6, and then I'll also need to make some plans away from that. But even, for example, just going from Son to Saka and then maybe making someone like Richarlison, someone like Bowen could be quite interesting too, right? Because that's another option that we have on game week 10. We know that this West Ham team have really, really good fixtures from game week 10 onwards. So I'm very happy to, for example, move into Bowen on game week 10 too from Richarlison. And that's another option as well. And that can actually give me, for example, the space to not have such a bad game week 11 on paper versus that Newcastle away fixture, and then actually maybe continue to improve my team in other ways. Now, when I look at other issues with my team, I think obviously maybe lack of an Arsenal defender is probably something that's a little bit glaring. Gordon, I'm actually very happy with. Now, obviously, Hwang Hee-chan, I think, is very interesting. Cole Palmer, super interesting. Neto continues to be very, very good in terms of getting those assists per game. But there's a lot of options and diversity. Even Morgan Gibbs White, who hit the post as well. These are all fixtures and players in particular who have good opportunities to get points going forwards. Palmer obviously doesn't have the fixture, sorry, if I just go back to that. But he's a case where he's a unique example where he's 4.9 playing for a good team and also on penalties. So a lot of, for example, budget options now that we can actually work towards so that we can actually afford these Salah plus Haaland draft structures. And as I said, those are kind of my transfer plans. I'm actually planning to roll my transfer. This is a week where I think a lot of us should be rolling our transfers anyways, because even if you're, let's say, wildcarded already, I just don't see the need to immediately book a transfer. I'm not the type of manager who does that, so I don't have any plans for it, unless, let's say, we get some leaks about Richarlison and his ability to start that fixture. Now, if we go back to, let's say, if you're a game week 10 wildcarder, I can understand, obviously, you might have actually rolled the transfer this week, but probably not because of the suspensions that we have, to, let's say, just dead end on game week 9. So if you're doing a game week 9 dead end, then maybe obviously it makes sense to for example, rectify your team in that sort of way. But I think this is a week where we can definitely consider rolling. Ultimately, if you own Spurs players, they've got a good fixture in hand. If you've been owning these Newcastle players, they still have a good fixture in hand. Even Haaland, for example, these City players, even Alvarez, he's got a good fixture. And then, yes, of course, even though Aston Villa have a home fixture, it's still a tough one. So you don't necessarily need to immediately move into Watkins or immediately move into Cash. So I think this is a week where we can definitely sort of sit on our teams and actually enjoy them as long as they, don't have glaring issues, suspensions, etc. going forwards. So that's it for me in terms of my game week 9 transfers, because it's more a case of me actually planning ahead towards game week 10. There is obviously an opportunity for me to maybe go out a trip here if I really wanted to. I just think that trip here is just such an interesting option that I'm probably going to find it very, very hard to get away from him. And if I actually have to be honest, I also made a huge mistake with Trippier on the wild card. I actually sold him at one point to go for Madison because I thought I was going for a Madison draft. And that actually meant that I couldn't keep Trippier in my team. So I actually bought back Trippier on the deadline for a 0.2 basically drop in terms of in the bank value. And that's life, right? You make some mistakes on the wild card, but you move on. As I said, very, very happy with the green arrow so far. If we look ahead, obviously, in terms of planning and things like that, I think what we need to also think about, from the very, very sort of long-term distance is double game week 20. It seems like there's probably a 90% probability being assigned for that by Ben Crellin. That's basically just going to move the blank fixture of game week 18, Brentford versus Man City, all the way towards game week 20. So just 2 weeks where we can probably think about actually maybe free hitting on 18. Because let's say if you actually want to keep Haaland in your team, and I think that's a very justifiable decision, going forwards, you're actually looking at a landscape where it might make sense to actually plan for a free hit 18 and then just keep Haaland and even Alvarez assets like that within your team, because why not? At the same time, I can kind of understand it. If you, let's say, even go with Haaland, for example, and Alvarez, that you might not actually be too interested in investing in this Brentford team. So actually, the double game week might not be too important for you, or even the blank game week. So that's one thing that I think we have to think about as managers. How do we sort of accommodate for game week 18? But that's something very, very far into the distance. In terms of planning ahead and teams, for example, to target, I do think that this Liverpool team is actually a team that a lot of people are sort of overrating in terms of how many good assets there really are. The reality is Trent is also very, very expensive. So I think that always makes him very, very tight to afford if you're on a Haaland solid draft structure. And then not to mention that, let's say someone like Darwin and even Luis Diaz, they're both going to be dealing with a little bit of issues, right? Because the international break is coming up. You know that when they come back from international duty, which they probably should be presumably going on, that they will need to rest, right? Gakpo is actually out of his brace and out of his boot, and he should be back. Jota as well is going to be coming back from his suspension. So this is not exactly the best situation to invest into Luis Diaz and someone like Darwin. Whereas when you look at Watkins, for example, his minutes are nailed. So don't, for example, always take the sort of higher upside option if you think there's a significant high downside too. And I think Watkins is actually arguably someone who actually has high reward and medium risk. And I think that's already better than someone who, for example, has high risk and high reward within Darwin. As far as Alvarez, we're also starting to see a little bit more rotation within the team. So he's also potentially even a transfer out, let's say, after the Brighton fixture. But it really depends, because obviously he still is a steal at his price compared to, let's say, a lot of other options. For example, Solanke, in my opinion, still doesn't compare to him. But it also is just a question about what you're sort of willing to sort of trade off with within the FPL landscape. In terms of future transfer plans, beyond game week 10, what I would say actually is we just need to keep an open mind to just reinvesting back into this Chelsea team. Yes, of course, there's the whole argument that, for example, someone like Sterling has only been doing well versus relegation teams or teams that are set to be relegated. But obviously, we're just talking about the promoted teams here, as well as Bournemouth and Fulham, who have been pretty dismaying so far. What I would say, though, is that this Chelsea team has still managed 3 clean sheets. They seem like a competent team. The underlying data is very good. I will be sort of updating my What We Have Learned series for Game Week 9, just because this is a convenient opportunity to look at an international break and, for example, reassess, with 9 game weeks of information so far, or rather 8 game weeks of information, what we can actually, improve upon in terms of our understanding of teams, and actually contextualize that with last season's results and see, whether we're, maybe, let's say, casting, let's say, Chelsea aside, for example, because I think what's interesting is Man United have been horrible so far, but then a team like Chelsea have also been sort of put in a basket of being terrible. But actually, there's been a huge gulf in terms of the quality performance that United have put out versus Chelsea, although the outcome in terms of, let's say, points and where they are at the table seems to be very similar. So that's something that I think is quite interesting that I'll update on. And I think that's it for me this week. So if you guys had a green arrow, red arrow, obviously go back to your process, your decision making. Were you happy with that? Ultimately, let's not, for example, get too upset. We have an international break to sort of reassess our decisions, see if we're comfortable with the moves that we've made. If you felt like you've made mistakes, it's a good time to reevaluate them. If you feel like you've been unlucky, that might just be the reality, right? This is how football is. I would not have predicted for Arsenal to come away from the City game and actually win 1-0 from effectively a very, very jammy goal. But this is life, and this is FPL, and this is footballing outcomes. And if you guys are interested in any sort of comments, if you guys have any questions in terms of transfers, feel free to drop them below. I'm happy to sort of answer them. We do obviously have 2 weeks to sort of reassess. Some injuries might prop up, and maybe I'll be forced to make a transfer by then. But my idea, of course, as I said, is to roll, and I'll see you guys next week.